What's up YouTube, this is Cody Bidlow with ATHLETE.X coming at you with another video. I want to talk to you today about something that kind of follows up the previous video, which was about the first 3 steps. So when you come out of the blocks, the first 3 steps, sometimes 4, are going to really be focused on pushing the ground away from you, behind you. Now obviously we don't want to ruin our timing by pushing for too long, but at the same time, if you don't push at all, then you're going to run into an issue where you're just going to tap dance and not really go anywhere. So we really want to utilize the time that we have early in the race to produce force in those first few steps, use time to our advantage, spend a little bit more time on the ground, and focus on pushing. Once you've achieved that and you've accomplished a few steps and you've pushed well, now the paradigm kind of shifts. Once you have some momentum built up, I personally believe that it can be more useful for some people to focus on popping the thigh forward. Now, why do we do this? Well, think of it this way. We want to create a stretch shortening cycle on the back side of the thigh, which is where the very powerful muscles of the leg are that help drive us forward. Now, if all we do is concentrically attack the ground, striking down and back, and that's all we focus on, a couple things can happen. First of all, you might cut short the stretch shortening cycle a little bit, say if your rhythm and your frequency isn't quite optimal. So you might actually, by trying to smash the ground concentrically, I mean like say your knee is up and you strike your leg down to the ground actively, if you do that and you don't focus at all on creating a stretch shortening cycle prior to that movement, you could be cutting yourself short or selling yourself short on the amount of force that you can actually apply into the ground. Second of all, if we really focus on back, down and back without any forward action of the leg, sometimes we can get into a position where we start striking too far back relative to our center of mass. Body starts to maintain too much of a forward tilt, and you could get into some backside mechanics, leaning too far forward, and then it becomes a race to not fall on your face. While we do want to focus on pushing behind us on those first 3 steps, after that, I think it can be useful for some people to pop the thigh forward, because what that does is when we pop the thigh forward, we allow the leg to come forward, we get some stretch on the hamstring, stretch on the glute, and then once those reach maximal stretch, there's a bunch of force loaded up in those muscles, and that is going to, boom, like a rubber band, swing your leg back to the ground, allowing you to attack the ground with more force than if you were to just try and concentrically smash it, okay? If I throw my arm up and then come back down, it happens a lot faster and more forcefully than if I go and try to just do it without that stretch shortening cycle. Same thing with throwing. If you take a ball and you hold it right here and you try to throw it, it's probably not going to go as far or as fast than if you take the ball, whip your arm back, and launch it with a stretch shortening cycle included. So this cue of popping the thigh forward helps us achieve that stretch shortening cycle on the muscles of the backside of the leg. Another thing that popping the thigh forward helps with is timing of the residual phase. So if you looked at my video on how to run fast and I talk about maximal velocity sprint mechanics, there's a phase called the residual phase, which is where once you've pushed into the ground and your foot and your leg are no longer generating force into the ground, the time it takes from when you stop generating force till the time that you accelerate the thigh forward, that's the residual phase. So imagine that you've pushed or you've struck the ground with your leg, and now your leg is behind you about to come off the ground, but it lags a little bit because you're focusing on something else. So your foot just kind of hangs out back there for a second. Well, that time that you're wasting is called the residual phase, and we want to minimize that as much as possible. Now, we don't want to sell ourselves short on our ground contact time and artificially reduce our ground contact time, because that's reducing our ability to propel ourselves forward, right? What we do on the ground sends us through the air, ultimately aiding in how well we run. But at the same time, if you spend too much time on the ground, first of all, it ends up leading toward you falling forward into the ground to some degree, and more importantly, it throws off the rhythm. So if your foot is on the ground too long, especially once you've accelerated a little bit, now you don't have enough time to bring the leg forward, back to the front side of the body and then strike back down to the ground if you spend too much time behind you. So this cue of popping the thigh forward once you're 3-4 steps into the run, or maybe even at about 10 meters depending on how well you start, that can be a great way to incorporate both concepts of applying a lot of force, spending more time on the ground early, but then progressing to a quicker rhythm where you're spending less time on the ground, spending more time in the air, and using cues at certain times of the run to assist you in a natural progression. What I've found is that if I just push behind me the whole way, I hit a certain point in the race or in the run where it's no longer really benefiting me to do that, and everything starts to feel like it's behind me. On the flip side, if I just pop the thigh forward from step 1, sometimes I find that I'm not utilizing that early period of the race to produce a lot of force in a horizontal direction, and so I sell myself short there. So by combining the two, using the first 3 steps to really produce a lot of force, spend more time on the ground and push yourself down the track, and then transitioning into popping the thigh forward, which once again creates that stretch shortening cycle on the back side of the leg, which increases the amount of force we're putting into the ground when the leg then naturally swings back down to the ground. When we do that, that's going to help facilitate reaching high top speeds later in the race. If you're focusing on spending time on the ground at top speed, well, you're probably not going to run that fast. So you can blend cues into your run and see what works and what doesn't. For some people, the push behind you out the first 3 steps might not work, and that's fine. You find something else. Maybe for you, pop the thigh forward right out of the blocks does work. For other people, maybe at top speed, striking downward from the position of like a quarter squat, where your thigh is not very parallel to the ground, it's at a lower angle, striking down from that position, maybe that works for someone. Great. But I think for the vast majority of people, there is, to some degree and for some period of time, a benefit to focusing on push the ground away from you, push the ground behind you on those first 3 steps, and then start popping the thigh forward quicker and quicker and quicker. And that's going to allow you to utilize those stretch shortening cycles to your advantage. As sprinters, the more we can use elastic tissues to our advantage, the less energy we're using in the muscles themselves to generate movement forward. So by popping the thigh forward, you get the stretch shortening cycle in, you get some elastic movement coming through, and ultimately it allows you to run faster, at least for some people, and the people that I've worked with, I've seen some good results with popping the thigh forward once you've started running and you have a little bit of speed built up, like I said, after the first 3 steps or after 10 meters, something like that. Now, what you don't want to do when you pop the thigh forward is throw the foot forward. If you throw the foot forward, then you're getting into a position where you're probably going to end up hurting your hamstring, or you're going to contact too far in front of the body, or you're just going to look like a doofus kicking your foot forward doing the straight leg bound down the track. So remember, it's not pop the foot forward, it's pop the thigh forward or pop the knee forward. Also, it's not drive the thigh up or drive the knee up, okay, because that can throw off your posture and tilt you back, cause a bunch of other issues. It's forward. Right when you feel like you've put some force into the ground, boom, that thigh needs to pop forward, okay? It needs to come through straight forward, and then once that happens, the foot's going to swing to about vertical, so the shin is vertical, and then boom, it's going to strike back at the ground. Now, some people would say, well, if you're not focusing on striking the ground, you're not putting force into the ground, and, what are you doing? I could see how you could come to that conclusion, but if you don't consider the stretch shortening cycle and stretching that hamstring and glute like a rubber band so that it can, boom, snap back and strike the leg down to the ground, if you forget that, you might overlook the benefits of cues that don't have to do with concentrically attacking the ground. Beyond that, it doesn't mean that you don't ever feel yourself striking down to the ground. It's not like because I pop the thigh forward, I never actively strike the ground. No, it's just increasing my ability to strike the ground with more force at high speeds because I'm using that stretch shortening cycle to my advantage. So the cue might be to pop the thigh forward, but you still, once you feel that leg reach its furthest point on the front side, you're still actively striking the ground. You're just using that stretch shortening cycle to your advantage, which is going to ultimately help you utilize the maximum amount of force production capabilities your body has and use it at the right times. Now also, like I talked about in the last video, this same thing is going to benefit from doing Nordic ham curls, doing single leg eccentrics on the back extension, doing kettlebell swings. You still want to develop those eccentric qualities in the hamstring group and the glutes, because what are we doing? Well, we're using the ability of the hamstrings to eccentrically load. That's what the stretch shortening cycle really is that eccentric loading, isometric point where it stops, and then concentrically shortening and firing back at the ground. We want to facilitate that from a physical standpoint. So how do we do that? Well, we strengthen the hamstrings, we work on power production in a horizontal direction and a vertical direction, and we prepare the body physically for the demands that it's going to be put under. So the exercises I suggested in my last video would still be relevant here, and I would still advise that you incorporate those. This video is more about considering the concepts behind how you're controlling the movements when you're accelerating, and how what you do in the first 3 steps can be different from what you do, say, at 10, 15, 20, 25 meters and so on. Lastly, as we do all this, we want to consistently rise our posture each step just a little bit. You don't want to go from here to here, okay? You don't want to stay here, and you don't want to start here. You want to start at a relatively horizontally oriented position, and then as you go, rise, 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 rise. For me, I find that I'm fully upright somewhere between 20 and 30 meters most of the time, and then I'm reaching my top speeds somewhere between 40 and 60 meters. So just because you're upright doesn't mean that your acceleration has stopped. I think confusing those two things is not necessarily the way to think about it. You still have the ability to accelerate as you are upright and sprinting upright. It's just that sometimes we think acceleration only happens when you're oriented horizontally, and that's not the case. You will accelerate at a faster rate when you're like that, but eventually you're not able to produce enough force in a horizontal direction to facilitate that position, so you have to become vertical. But that doesn't mean you stop accelerating. You still want to keep building up speed, building up frequency, until you reach a point where you run out of juice, and now it's time to just hang on and get through to the end of the race. So guys, I hope that this was somewhat helpful and could clarify what you do very early versus kind of in the middle of your acceleration. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I or someone else will probably get back to you. Also, if you're looking for programs, check out my website, ATHLETE.X. Got some shirts too. You can rep ATHLETE.X while you're out on the track. Let everyone know you like speed, power, and strength. And hit a like, hit that subscribe if you haven't watched this video. Stay tuned for my next one. Thanks for tuning in.